part of being an effective and savvy writer, particularly a writer for college, is not only finding sources that will teach us things and influence us, so locating sources through databases or the internet, going to a library, looking in our own resources, we can find them, but we also then evaluate those sources for their credibility, their accuracy, how deep and wide is the information that they cover. So in other words, the scope, among other things for evaluating. We also then will integrate those sources. We will paraphrase, summarize, quote, and we'll do those things effectively to get the other ideas blended or synthesized with our own. But something that some students don't think about and some writers don't think about is that part of being savvy and effective in the way that we're using sources is to think through and to understand what role those sources are playing. In other words, what kind of influence or position do those sources have in relationship to our work? And that could be early on in our reading when we're doing the research. It could also be in the way that we write things, in the way that we incorporate it. So thinking through how a source is influencing us, how we are blending it, what it's doing, can help us then understand, should we keep it? What is it? How effective can I use it? What is my audience going to think? And that kind of thing. It helps us comprehend not only the sources we're using more fully, but it also can help us comprehend how we're putting our work together. Rather than this linear, I checked off, I used my source, I can move on to something else. We're thinking about these things as being much more complicated than that, and understanding or thinking about what role a source is playing or what multiple roles a source can play can also help us think about how to integrate it, how to use it, what it's doing overall for our thinking and our knowledge. Something else to think about in terms of understanding a source's role is that also can sometimes directly influence how we integrate it. So what role it plays can directly connect to then if we summarize it rather than paraphrase it. It could directly influence that we would quote it rather than summarize or something else. So understanding what it's doing there can help us know how to use it. So let's take a look at what Harvard tells us. I'm looking at the Harvard Guide to Using Sources, and this is a really good source overall that helps us not only locate and evaluate and integrate some information here about that, but it has this page about understanding a source's role. It also has resources here for citing, avoiding plagiarism, and a few other things. So easily found online, the URL's here at the top of the screen, but also easily found through a search, Harvard Guide to Using Sources. There are drop-down menus here that I'm not going to expand so that I have more time to look at some examples, but this is easy enough to locate and do some reading to further understand how Harvard is explaining what some of these points are. So the first one on their list, and each of these are framed as a question that we then could try to answer it in terms of a statement. So the first one, does your assignment include instructions on source use? In other words, does the prompt tell you what you're supposed to do with the source, or does it give you some specific instructions, guidelines, and that kind of thing? I'm going to take a quick look at an example. Here's an assignment prompt that says right here, and I'll highlight it because there's a lot of background on the assignment, etc. In this case, the professor will give the student an article. So it's one article, and that the student is then analyzing that article. So here we have the instructions. They have one piece, that's one source, and the use is for analysis. So then as the student writes up this assignment, which is a rhetorical analysis, they are using that source as the core. They're looking at it and they're pulling the evidence from it. They're making determinations about that source. So that, in this case, has clear instructions about the use. Another quick example is an assignment that is an annotated bibliography. In this case, this assignment doesn't give the students the sources. The student has to find them, but it does give clear instructions about what to do with those sources. In this case, each of the entries in the annotated bibliography needs to be formatted in this way. It has to have a full bibliographic citation. So the full bibliographic information means everything about the publication and where to find it. There needs to be a summary, there needs to be an evaluation of that source, and there has to be a suggested role for what that source might do in the next assignment. So as the students find the sources and read about it, they should summarize the overall text. They should evaluate the text using vocabulary like from evaluating like its currency, its accuracy, its authority. So that has to go there. Again, clear instructions. And then the student has to suggest what the role is going to do, which is a part of what this video is about. So those are two examples of assignments telling us what to do. The next one on this list, does the source provide context or background information about the particular topic? In other words, does the source give you a history? Does it help you understand maybe where an argument or a disagreement or a viewpoint is coming from? Does it place it within a timeline of some kind, a projection into the future? So does the source maybe teach you something about where this is coming from or how it's connected to other things? That's what we mean by context and background. So the next one on the list, has the source shaped your argument? Has it essentially raised questions for you that you then are like, I wonder what else there is to know, or I didn't think about this? Does it suggest a line of thinking? Maybe it teaches you something, or it points you in a particular direction, or it helps you draw conclusions because you've read enough about it, so therefore logically this may be the outcome, whatever that is. Does it provide a provocative quotation? So is it something that somebody has made a statement that got you fired up, or it showed you something, or it raised an alarm, or it was very motivating or something else? And so that's the role that the source is playing. Again, as I've said before, it's possible for a single source to play more than one role, but sometimes it could be a single source that plays a single role. So there could be one source that puts something in context, or one source that gives you this quotation, or one source that raises the question. But think about, most sources are probably playing more than one role. So I'm going to pause here to take a look at another example. Here is a piece called "You'll Never Be Famous and That's Okay," written by Emily Esfahani Smith, and it's published in the on-campus part of the opinion section of the New York Times. This section is geared toward college students, maybe late high school, but it's writing about and for students who are in college. The opinion section isn't pure viewpoint or all about her personal tastes. Instead, it's something that she's coming to from her particular perspective, and most of the time an opinion section is informed. The authors of opinion pieces have read things, they've thought about things, they're looking at other examples. So they're not just here spouting off about something that they like or don't like, although occasionally that can happen. Most of the time, particularly in a newspaper, we're going to see somebody's writing that has examples and information, etc. So if we come back to this list, we can see, does it provide a context or a background? Does it shape a line of thinking? And the reason I want to look at this one is, if we scroll down to her piece, so she's writing about college students and the desire to be happy and live meaningful lives and this kind of thing. So she, further in her piece, she says, I've interviewed dozens of people about what they think gives their lives meaning. I've read thousands of pages, in particular psychology, philosophy, neuroscience. She's read thousands of pages of research, and collectively those interviews and that research helps her to understand what truly brings people satisfaction. So this is basically her thesis. So this is the conclusion that she's drawing based on all of this research that she's done. And then the rest of the writing is essentially going to extend this. So she's setting us up. She doesn't name any of the sources here. She doesn't tell us who she's interviewed. She doesn't have to. She's instead pointing to, I've read, I've talked, I've listened, I've thought, and I've drawn some conclusions. An opinion piece makes sense for her to write about herself. In other kinds of academic writing, it may not make sense for you to write about yourself. So don't default to writing something like I read. Instead, she, in an opinion piece, her personal view, she's telling us what she did to draw her conclusions. So again, coming back to the Harvard Guide, we have an example there of ideas that are shaping her line of thinking. They certainly gave her some questions to think about, but reading through those things, talking to people are giving her ideas for the conclusions that she's drawing. We'll take a look at a couple of these others here in a minute, looking at F. Sahani Smith's writing. So I'm going to move on to this next one. Does the source serve as an authoritative voice in support of your claims? Thinking about authority, what kind of credibility does that source have? Smith's work, she's mentioned that she's read psychologists, philosophers, neuroscientists. I think I may have said psychiatrist a minute ago, but psychology, philosophy, neuroscience, the experts. So these are starting to be authority. She didn't just come up with this all on her own. She's looking to people who would study this kind of stuff. Human psychology, human viewpoints, what people think about, what makes them happy or satisfied or feeling like they have a meaningful life. These are not things easily counted. So she's going to the experts. Again, coming back to the Harvard Guide. So if she's quoting from them, sometimes it makes sense to say, this person said that, or this body that studied it said it, or these are the words that come from someone else that gives them the authority. This also connects back to how I said you may think about how you use that source depending on the role. So it could very well be that the authority should stay and you want to borrow some of that authority, in which case maybe you would quote from that piece rather than summarize it or simply paraphrase from it. But in other cases, if it's giving you line of thinking or it's raising, changing your thinking or that kind of thing, which kind of the same thing I just said. Sorry about that. So if it's teaching you and informing you, you've read multiple sources that have done that, in which case it would make more sense to paraphrase those things or to summarize them collectively to come to this line of thinking. So again, the role can very well tie to how you integrate it. The next thing on the list, does the source provide any evidence? So the difference between evidence and giving you a line of thinking or providing a quote is that evidence is sort of the support. You're able to think of something, or you have a question that you're trying to answer, so you make a claim, a statement about it, but then the evidence extends that claim. It supports it. It demonstrates it. It shows your audience the proof, in other words. Sometimes students think about evidence as only being things like numbers or statistics. That can be evidence, but so can testimony. So a witness saw something happen. The witness is providing evidence that the witness was there. By the way, the witness also becomes an authoritative voice because the witness was there. We could also think about that with narrative. So somebody's telling a story, they lived through something, they're providing the evidence by testifying to what they've lived through or relating what they've lived through. But again, they're also an authoritative voice because they lived through it, not us. If we come back to the Smith example, what she also does is she uses a work of fiction by the author George Eliot, and the book is called Middlemarch. What Smith does is that she summarizes, and I won't highlight all of it, but she essentially summarizes what happens in this novel, in part to show or demonstrate that people, in this case made up people, that they're doing exactly what she's thinking about. That she says that people who live meaningful lives are often more satisfied than people who are always chasing after fame or fortune. That people who are satisfied with their existence are often happier than people who are trying to chase after something fleeting like fame. And so she uses the fiction because they very kind of perfectly line up to what the point is she's trying to make. This is serving as an extended example that shows her claim or supports her claim. It also helps her take something that's fiction, that is story-based. Often humans learn from stories, or we can imagine stories better than we can sometimes real life. And she's using that story to then connect back to real world. So again, coming back to the Harvard Guide, she's using examples, authoritative, not so much as in that George Eliot was an expert scientist, but George Eliot was an expert on human behavior. And she's using evidence as in, here is an extended example to kind of demonstrate what it is that I mean. If we look further down in her study, or sorry, in her page, her opinion piece, we see that she's now connecting the fiction to what happens in the real world. She mentions Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook, obituaries and newspapers, things like that. And then she actually points to specific studies. In part 2 of this video, I'm going to take a look at this a little more closely and look at one more example in terms of how these sources play a role.